In this session, we're going to show a presentation from the Street Identity Conference called the LMNOP Ecosystem. We're going to go through a couple areas. First, to talk about what brought us together at this conference and this particular topic. And then we're going to go through the original LMNOP deck that's actually been available for a while and shown at some other conferences. Then we're going to discuss the progress that is made, towards this envisioned idea, at least as demonstrated at the conference, and then talk about next steps and some additional sessions you can watch. So why has Google been involved in this particularly? There are two particular areas that have gotten Google involved in more internet identity standards. One is that Google is in the business of helping people find websites, especially websites they've never dealt with before. But if the user goes to a website they've never dealt with before, and then they have to go through one of those painful sign-up flows, then we haven't helped them as much as we'd like. And in fact, sometimes they don't even want to click through to those sites because they just want to avoid the pain of a sign-up process. So one of Google's incentives is to get to the point where users can honestly believe that pretty much any new website they go to on the internet, they'll be able to sign in and sign up very easily. Now, a second incentive Google has is that as people have had to go through these painful sign-up flows at lots of websites, one thing that they've started to do is reuse the same password on lots of different websites. Unfortunately, this has led to a big increase in account hijacking. What hackers have realized is that they don't need to break through the security of a Google or Facebook or Microsoft to break into your account. They just have to find any website where you're logging in with the same password as your Google account. They break through the probably poor security of that website, get your password there, and now they can go use it at other websites, again, like Google, Facebook, PayPal, etc., where you log in with the same email address and password. And for the last 2 years, the types of techniques the hackers are using to make money off these hijacked accounts have become much more intensive. For example, they'll lock the user out of the account. They'll send mail to all the user's friends claiming that the person is stuck in a hotel and can't pay the bill, etc. And to avoid circumstances where the person might get the account back and tell their friends, no, don't send money, hackers frequently just delete the user's information out of the account as soon as they take it over. So this is obviously very unpleasant for the user to have their account hijacked, hard for them to take it back and get it back for themselves, and even if they do, sometimes their data is gone. So Google has this second incentive to reduce that pain that some users feel. Now, if we go back a couple years ago, early 2008, this is when a lot of the large webmail providers recognized we had this common problem around password reuse on the web. And a group of us looked around, found that there was this existing foundation called the OpenID Foundation, whose goals were very close to solving this problem. And so since that point, we've been heavily involved in a form of co-opetition since then. We companies are competitors with each other, but we found in this particular scenario, our interests were aligned. And so since then, we've been focusing on user experience, simplifying the technology options, especially around technology called OAuth, as well as increasing the value proposition for websites to stop having these low security password reuse mechanisms and use something else, in this case, techniques along the lines of OpenID. And in 2012, the foundation is actually shifting into a much more advanced marketing option now that we believe we have solid solutions for the user experience, technology, value, etc. We're going to be going out and trying to convince most website operators that they are the weakest link in internet security today, and that by taking some other approaches, they can stop being the weakest link and make their sign-in and sign-up experiences much easier. Now, unfortunately, you solve one problem, sometimes you create another one. In this case, if we get a lot of websites to stop requiring passwords from users and instead support the idea of big identity providers who are specialists, then all of a sudden the users can end up with a smaller number of accounts like Facebook, Microsoft, Google accounts that if a hacker is able to take them over, they can now get into a very large number of other websites that are relying on that central account. So we refer to this as the keys to the kingdom problem. There's this now more powerful key that accesses lots of websites. And so there's an additional set of work going on to try to more strongly protect those powerful keys. In Google's case, we have a tool called the Google Authenticator that users can opt in to protect their account with not just a password, but they have to associate their phone number with it, and every time they log in from a new computer, we send a code to their phone, somewhat like some of you may have experienced logging into online banking. Unfortunately, this is a painful experience for users, so we still need to do a lot to improve the usability for it. So, as a community, other people like Facebook, Microsoft, playing with similar related solutions, but we're all looking for techniques that can do a better job of securing this more powerful account while also improving the usability. While I talked about the big webmail providers working on this since 2008, certainly they're not the only ones who have been aware of it. There's a large internet identity community that uses workshops like the IIW, which is the Internet Identity Workshop, where a lot of geeks in this area get together and talk. There's also been efforts by countries, including the US government, to try to figure out how to make it easier for citizens to log into US government websites, developing certification schemes to try to certify these identity providers as actually having really good security. And now there are efforts like the US government's INSTIC, the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, and other countries' equivalents to try to figure out how to get websites to improve their security and not have this password reuse problem. So back in April of 2011, there was a presentation called the LMNOP focusing on this particular issue and how we could pull a lot of the pieces together. What I'm going to do now is go through that presentation and then talk about the progress that's been made since then. So this is that called Identity as Easy as LMNOP. And those letters refer to the different layers we see happening in the identity ecosystem, where up at the top layer, the part that users generally interface with is authenticating themselves to a website with passwords. But now we're going to talk about other layers that we think we can build underneath that to improve security, such as use of OpenID, phone numbers, mobile operators, and in fact even your local government. So let's start with passwords. That's the part that users are most used to. People hate them, we know they're not that secure, and password reuse is making things much worse. So as I mentioned before, in concert with the OpenID Foundation, a lot of the big providers out there are trying to convince the majority of websites that they shouldn't be in the password business. They should be outsourcing that to identity provider experts. So this is the type of thing where you go to a website and you see a Facebook button or a Google button, or you enter your email address and you're redirected to one of these identity providers. So OpenID certainly helps, and it's made a lot of progress in this area. As I mentioned, working on simplifying technology, improving the user experience, already has schemes for things like certification. So a lot of progress has been made. But there are two things OpenID specifically does not do. One, it doesn't specify how the user is actually authenticated, in particular to the identity provider. Second, it doesn't map to real-world identities. It specifically maps to online identities. Now, an interesting thing to note is if you look at the largest identity providers, such as Facebook, Google, Yahoo, etc., you'll notice that many of them have started to gather phone numbers from users when new accounts are set up, or asking existing users to provide phone numbers. A main reason they are doing this is that if the user's account is hijacked, then when the real owner tries to recover it, one way they can prove they're the real owner is having a code sent to that phone number that they still control. So identity geeks call this two-factor authentication. And some of those identity providers are even trying to get users to turn this on, not just as for a scheme for when their account is stolen, but to require these two-factor authentication every time the user logs into a new computer to protect their account. So it's interesting to see these big internet identity providers already starting to rely on phone numbers as a key element of how they authenticate users. Now, if we take that an element further, obviously the phone numbers are generally supported by the mobile operators, who in this case have issued the phone number to the users. And in fact, what's interesting to note is the mobile operators have a much better way of authenticating real human owners of accounts. They have stores you can walk into, you can show your government ID, they know your address, they can send information to your home. That type of information usually is not associated with, say, your generic Yahoo Mail account that you set up for free. So there's the potential for these identity providers to more closely work with the mobile operators to leverage their real-world information about the user's identity and their strong ability to authenticate not just humans, but also the actual phone that you're holding in your hand. So there have been many techniques suggested over the years for how to combine mobile operators and these identity providers to have stronger authentication, better usability. However, one of the challenges has been there's been no economic incentive for mobile operators to do this. The where is the money question. And we're going to come back to that in a moment. But now let's go to the next piece. We keep on talking about this being a layer. Users go to websites. Websites should support identity providers. Identity providers relying on phone numbers that come from mobile operators. So what do mobile operators rely on? Well, a common one is, imagine you lose your mobile phone. What do you do if you need a replacement quickly? You find the closest store, you go in and you show your government-issued photo ID to prove who you are, and they can help you issue a new phone. So it's interesting to note that we're already at this lowest level relying on our local governments for identity verification, not in electronic form, but as our sort of last bootstrap mechanism. Now, one thing people could suggest then is, oh, well, government should just have an electronic form of the government-issued ID, and that will solve all our identity problems. It will authenticate you to devices, it will have information on your real identity, etc. Life is never that simple, and in fact, many different governments around the world have experimented with this and found it's very hard to achieve that goal. In the US government, there was actually a national strategy letter that was signed in the summer of 2011 called NSTIC, where the US government specifically said that the US government is not going to play this role of being the electronic user ID for citizens on the internet, that they instead feel this is an area where businesses and industry need to get involved. So if you look through these LMNOP layers, it certainly helps with identity on the web, but it has these problems that, number one, OpenID doesn't help map to real-world identity. The second is that there's no economic incentive for mobile operators to help with authentication and identity verification. And the third is that there's specific things that at least the US government, but now many other governments are saying that they don't want to do in the electronic ID space. So let's put that aside for a moment, and let's talk about another technique that's actually already common in the industry today relating to identity verification. So in this example, if you want to read it, Frank was in the Bay Area, had maybe some heart problems, had to go to the hospital for an emergency locally there. He goes home and he's like, oh, I want to get a copy of my medical records. One option that exists for many hospitals is he could go to the hospital website, create an account online, enter his name and his claimed billing address. Now, the hospital needs to have a way to verify that he is in fact, the Frank who lives at that address. So the way they do it is they send a letter or postcard to his house, and when Frank opens it, he finds there's a code on it, and he's told that he has to go back to the website, he has to log in with the account he created, and type that code to verify who he is. So this is relatively cheap, a couple dollars to do it, but it's obviously very painful for the user, and as you can imagine, a lot of users don't finish the process. And while we say it's relatively cheap, a couple dollars, well, that's pretty expensive multiplied over hundreds of thousands or millions of users. So imagine for a moment that Frank's mobile operator, who already has verified their identity, just have a billing relationship with them, and who has issued a phone to him that they know is associated with the account. Imagine they help provide information to this hospital website about his real-world identity and how strongly he was authenticated. So Frank's experience instead could be he goes to Stanford Hospital's website, he logs in using OpenID, he tells his identity provider to share with Stanford his street address. Stanford then ends up getting, technically speaking, an OAuth token, but basically what he means is the ability to go back to his mobile operator and get Frank's verified address and confirmation of how he was strongly authenticated. In this case, the mobile operator would actually charge the website, the Stanford Hospital website, for that information. And once the website actually has it, they could now show Frank his records. And generally speaking, as long as the price of this was cheaper than the hospital doing it themselves, and if some subset of users would have already performed this verification in the past, well, then it will be a better and cheaper experience for the hospital or any other website that needs identity verification. And in fact, based on market research last year, we found there are a lot of websites who would like to be able to verify a user's identity. We talked about the fact that email providers and social networks already have problems with account recovery, but then there are many different businesses that are trying to move their interactions with their users online. Banks, e-commerce sites, utility vendors, hospitals, schools, etc. Even the TV industry that wants to help people watch TV content online instead of being limited to their house. Well, in all these cases, these businesses have a relationship with the user that's in person, involving the real world identity. And the question they then have is, how do they connect a user's online identity with that real world identity? And this is a technique that can be used for that. So this LMNOP and street identity concept solved these three problems. The first one was OpenID didn't map to real world identity. Fine, but there are vendors like mobile operators who can verify a user's address and then in turn share it with multiple websites. And the second was the question of, okay, what's the economic incentive? Well, the vendors who verify these attributes for a user can charge websites for getting access to that verified information. And just doing ballpark math, for a large number of users, just going to a few websites that need to verify their address, there's a lot of money to be made in this type of verification. And the third problem we talked about is there's tests that at least the U.S. government doesn't plan to be. However, the government has created this group NSTIC to evaluate schemes like this and talked about their desire to be an early adopter and even payer for these types of schemes. So that's the identity as easy as LMNOP deck. And as I said, that came from April of 2011. Now in this recent street identity conference run by the OX and DC in November of 2011, we did a demonstration of how attribute providers worked. And if you go to some of the previous videos linked from the StreetIdenty.com working group site, you can watch some of those overview videos. If you watch those videos, you actually see that this model of attribute providers, verifying street addresses, money flowing back and forth, is now working. And in fact, the Google part of it is live. Google as a user's relationship manager to get the user's consent to share information. And we're starting to see attribute providers come online, similar to ID Data Web. So we did show those some progress in that area in the demos, but there are some pieces of this LMNOP model that were not shown in those demos. The first is that we didn't actually show how the identity verification happened. We didn't actually, show the money exchanging hands. Sorry, we did show the identity verification, and we did show how the money was exchange hands, but we did not show how the user was actually authenticated. And there are a lot of different ways this could be done, especially if we're going to try to more strongly authenticate the users and passwords. For example, as I mentioned earlier, Google has this scheme called a Google Authenticator that can be used to require a user on a new computer not just to type their password, but to enter a code that is sent to their phone. And interestingly, we think we can build upon the economic model of attribute providers to have economic incentives for authentication providers. So imagine a website who wants to not just know a user's verified address, but they want to know that they were strongly authenticated. One of the models is that they may pay for that information. Just like they might pay the user's attribute provider for a verified street address, they might also pay the user's authentication provider for confirmation that the user was authenticated with something stronger than a password, such as a one-time password, or even more advanced schemes like digital certificates, if you're familiar with those, that in many cases can be associated with a mobile phone. There's also the ability to build on this. There are lots of other attributes, and there are different ways of verifying those attributes. For example, maybe instead of verifying a user's street address by sending a postcard to their house, maybe there's an in-person proofing done where they show a government-issued ID. The more expensive the identity verification is, or the authentication is, the more money that could potentially be charged to websites to get that verified information. So that, of course, raises questions. Who are going to be these authentication providers to do a good job of this if there is, money in it? We talked about some of the large consumer identity providers like Facebook and Google are making progress in this space, but the money is starting to attract other companies, which is why this recent conference had so many attendees, including the mobile carriers. And the mobile carriers are interesting because you as a user are already walking around with a device that the mobile carrier knows is associated with you. So one of the questions is, how could we, at least on that mobile device, avoid the need for you to ever type a password and instead use the digital certificate or SIM card on that phone to help you get logged in to your web browser and any website you visit? So one of the models that's being suggested is the idea of linking your mobile account with your identity provider or relationship provider. So imagine, shown in this example, a user has just gone to their mobile provider, MobileX, and has purchased a new phone. And near the end of the process, MobileX tells the person, hey, if you'll let us link your account with your Google account, we can help you when you get your new phone for it to be automatically linked to your Google account, and it's more secure. Sounds great to the user. They say they're interested. They get bounced over to a page at Google where Google asks the user, is it okay for MobileX to help you log into new devices and to provide your verified street address to websites that the user wants to give that information to? Assuming the user does consent, then later the user, for example Bonnie, she might actually get that phone, comes to her house, opens it, turns it on. When she turns it on, generally speaking, it would probably be in a locked mode. She would have to unlock it, typing in a code or pen, drawing a finger, whatever the scheme is. As soon as she does that, she'll actually notice that her mail, her address book starts syncing automatically. She can start calling friends by just selecting their name instead of typing phone numbers. But in addition, there are techniques we're going to talk about in other sessions for how the browser can then be automatically logged into her account. And if in the browser she goes and visits a website that's a relying party, it can detect that, in fact, on this browser session she was strongly authenticated. But again, of course, it's important that there's a fee involved in that. The website would pay to get that information. But to, Bonnie's, turn on the phone, unlock it, open the browser, go to a website with, high security information like financial, health, etc. But just with a few clicks and never typing a password, she accesses her information. Now, we're going to, in other sessions, talk about behind the scenes what had to happen to make this all work. And actually, there are quite a lot of details behind the scenes. But again, the end user experience is designed to be very simple and powerful. So if you're interested, if you visit the StreetIdentity.com site in the working group for the Attribute Exchange Network, you'll find there slides and videos of other sessions that drill down into more details of this. One of them is just talking about some of the economic and other business challenges of being an authentication provider for something stronger than a password. Another one is going to talk about the flow for being an attribute provider and how websites can get verified addresses, whether it's the user's street address, age, whether they were a college graduate of a certain school, etc. And then finally, there's a session that puts all of this together for the LMNOP flow. It talks about how to hook an attribute provider and a authentication provider together to achieve the goals we just described. I hope this was interesting to you, and I hope you will choose to follow up and read some of those slides and other presentations.